welcome everyone. Today we are meeting the Special Committee on Poverty. We are meeting to hear from a couple of different presenters. We will have Dr. Christine Saulnier from the Canadian Centre for Policy and Alternatives, and that will be followed by a presentation from Mary Boyd and Carl Percy, who are with the PEI Coalition for an poverty eradication strategy. So before we get started, we'd just like to briefly go over what the mandate of this committee is. So this committee is looking at establishing or recommendations to establish clear definitions and measures of poverty and a living wage for Prince Edward Island. This committee is also providing recommendations that are fully costed regarding the creation of a basic income guarantee pilot for Prince Edward Island. Noting the members who are here today, we have myself, Trish Altaz, Honorable Ernie Hudson, Sydney McEwen is sitting in for Honorable Natalie Jameson, and we have Gordon McNeely and Sunny Gallant will be here, as well as Hannah Bell. All right, so just want to also acknowledge we have, I see Roxanne Carter-Thompson has joined us today from the Adventure Group. Thank you very much for being here. And we need someone to approve the agenda, which has circulated. Anybody? All right, Minister Hudson, wonderful. All in favor of the agenda? Yes, consensus. Great. All right, so with that, just to note that our first presenter is joining us via Skype, so we will, once we move into the question period, have to be fairly strict with acknowledging people by name first before we switch, between the presenter and the questions, just for technical purposes. So just to be aware of that. All right, so at this point, I will be handing over the floor to Dr. Saulnier, and she will have an opportunity to present to the committee, and then we will open the floor to questions. So Dr. Saulnier, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I know that everybody is preoccupied with COVID-19, and of course, it's related to what we do. We support and protect the most vulnerable in our society. Is the connection okay?
Sean, what would you recommend?
I think we'll give it a few moments more, and if it's consistently interrupting, we might try a recess, but let's keep going just for the moment.
Okay. So I wanted to explain kind of how the living wage movement developed in Canada, how the living wage is actually calculated, and tell you, what involved in this I'm bringing to this discussion. So I've been involved in living wage work here since about 2016, and we began to try to figure out how we could...
Sorry, Doctor, to interrupt. We're still having some breakup in your sound here. We might need to take a recess and check into this.
Oh, all right. Okay.
Sorry about that. So we'll just take a brief recess and see if we can get the sound working. right, sorry about that, everyone. So we're hoping that we have now resolved the sound issue. So again, we will hand over the floor to Dr. Saulnier. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay. So I was saying that I've been involved in the work since about 2013 when we tried to launch the work in Atlantic Canada. But my BC colleagues have been involved in the work since 2008. And they really did kickstart the work in Canada around that time. And the work they did, BC really has involved the living wage framework, which is what we use to do the calculations. So the first report in Atlantic Canada was released in June 2015. And that was to calculate living wage for Halifax.
I'm so sorry, but again, it's cutting out, which is so unfortunate. We're really looking forward to your presentation, so I'm not sure if we'll just take another recess we'll figure it out from there. Okay.
I know this is. We've still been dropping your audio a fair bit. We have a suggestion, if you're willing. There is a scheduled second presentation today done by Mary Boyd and Carl Percy. We're thinking we could perhaps proceed with their presentation now because they're already here. And if you're willing to wait, we could try again after their presentation, see if either your connection or our connection has improved.
Okay, sure. I've got is there anybody that I can talk to at the test?
Is there anyone she can test with?
Oh, that you can test with while it's going on. I could check with our technician, Laura, in the booth. There's a couple of different terminals in there. She might be able to try something with you in the interim.
Is that okay with you, Carl and Mary?
Yeah.
Have we checked in? Should check in.
Okay. So we're just going to check with Laura. We'll be right back.
Are you guys okay with going first? I'm sorry about that. You all right? Okay, I apologize for this.
Hello, Doctor.
Oh, sorry, Sean.
Our technician, Laura, says that she should be able to do some test Skyping with you through her phone while the presentation by the other guest is in progress.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Again, we're sorry about all the inconvenience attached to this, but the internet doesn't always cooperate.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay, hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Okay. Come back from recess. Oh, yes. Okay.
All right, are you all set there? Do you want a minute? We sort of put them up. All right, so we have made a slight adjustment to our agenda, and I just want to thank our next presenters for being so accommodating. Unfortunately, due to the technical difficulties, we will not be able to hear from Dr. Saulnier, at least first. We're going to hopefully try to fix that in the background while our next presenters are presenting, and hopefully she'll be able to join us after this presentation. So first up now, we will have Mary Boyd and Carl Percy, who are here representing the PEI Coalition for a Poverty Eradication Strategy, and we thank them very much for being here today and for being flexible in the scheduling of their presentations. So with that, it will be the same sort of format. You'll have an opportunity to present, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
And just to say before we begin, thank you for inviting us, and also we're sorry that we didn't hear Christine before we present, because we have very, very high respect for Dr. Christine Saulnier, and she's been a good advisor to us many times. And also, we apologize because we're not going to stick precisely to the definitions you've laid out, because we can't really, but I think we're still there. As far as the definition of poverty, we think that you probably have heard it from so many people, but certainly lacking the basic needs for life is the shortest definition we can give for the state of poverty. There are lots of other things we can include, and maybe in conversations we will. The eradication of poverty on Prince Edward Island has been a preoccupation of the above groups and the coalition for many years. Both organizations have a long history of working for just wages and working conditions, reform of social assistance to lift the recipients out of poverty, adequate and good quality housing, especially for people on social assistance, full-time and meaningful work opportunities, including full-time work for those who desire it, a fairer EI system, and access to essential health care. We congratulate the government for its recent increases to social assistance recipients, and we are pleased that poverty eradication has such a high profile at the moment, something that has been building up over the years thanks to awareness raising by several organizations and a media that for the most part provides excellent coverage. We are here today to share our views and our experience in the hope that we will find the best possible way to eradicate poverty in PEI. It is important that we get it right this time, because too many people have had to suffer in poverty with terrible consequences from poor health, premature death, lost opportunities, discouragement, terrible living conditions, including suffering from cold in the winter, feeling of loss of self-worth, and stigma. It is unbelievable that 31 years after the House of Commons all-party unanimous resolution to end child poverty in Canada by the year 2000, the national rate is 18.6%. This province also has an 18.6% child poverty rate as measured by the low-income measure LIM after tax. We believe the LIM is a better measure of poverty in Canada than the market basket measure, which tends to understate the extent of poverty. So, bottom line, There are 23,710 people of all ages suffering poverty in PEI, according to the latest available statistics.
When we address the problem of poverty and PEI in Canada, unemployment must always be factored into the list of causes. PEI has always had a high unemployment rate. The current 8% is the lowest rate in a very long time, but it is second only to Newfoundland and Labrador for the highest rate in Canada. The official number of 7,000 unemployed in PEI doesn't include part-time workers who would prefer full-time work, and those who have given up searching for work are not included there either. So the number of unemployed is much greater, and this is not due to the failure of people, but to the economy and its policies. We are forced to accept full employment concept that there will always be numbers of unemployed in Canada, and therefore the rate of unemployment is between 5 and 6%, and it's supposed to be normal. These are people who have been left behind and mostly invisible. They are often considered as failures, and many have internalized this judgment. Progressive economists place the failure not on the person, but on the economy. People want to work, not just out of necessity. Unemployment is very serious because it is responsible for many mental health problems, such as depression, and many socially related problems. We overlook the enormous personal cost. In other words, of economist Dr. Polita Krechneva of Brad College, unemployment is vicious and leaves a stigma, the mark of unemployment. It causes permanent and high increase in mortality, increases in suicides, and long-term effects of people's well-being. It is costly to individuals, families, and communities, causing permanent loss of lifetime earnings, permanent negative impact on social participation and social capital, and rise in physical, mental problems, and health costs. She points out to the negative impact on child growth, nutrition, school and labor market outcomes, and increase in crime, disability, and alcoholism. As well, there are direct and indirect financial costs to provinces and the country, and output loss. Furthermore, the chronically unemployed are often overlooked by employers who want to hire people with experience and knowledge. Okay.
In searching for effective ways to eradicate poverty, we recommend the work of economists such as Dr. Pavlina Cherneva of Bard College and Dr. Stephanie Kelton of Stony Brook University. They recommend a job guarantee, which is a public option for jobs offering decent work at decent pay, a living wage plus benefits including medical and child care and paid leave. The job guarantee is a bottom-up job safety net, a public option for work which is federally funded and administered locally. It consists of a job bank of public service jobs which organize human potential and power to fill the many needs and gaps that exist. It is aimed directly at the unemployed. It is not compulsory, and it is permanent, the final piece of the social safety net. It is not 100% employment, as it doesn't expect that everyone should be working. It is not a handout, and it does not make work or just another infrastructure program. There are direct, immediate results. Dr. Cherneva estimates that the money spent in the USA on recovery from the 2008-09 recession would have created 20 million jobs under the job guarantee and would have hastened the recovery rather than taking so many months to restore the economy. So basically the job guarantee says if you want to work, we will provide a decent job with decent pay and benefits, and you will receive the training and skills you need for your job. The number of people who want to work will have a job. It organizes human potential to fill the needs gaps. It is counter-cyclical and shrinks as the economy recovers.
The job guarantee's strength and the reason of interest our member group is that it is aimed directly at the right to employment. The bottom-up program is financed by the federal government. It raises wages, thereby raising the whole income floor. It is the final piece of the social safety net. The job guarantee can be implemented faster than basic income. It stabilizes the labor market and doesn't require so much time to restore the employment rate. It has direct, immediate results. The pool of unemployed is a stabilizer. Dr. Chesneva reminds us that unemployment is already paid for. The effective minimum wage raises the floor. It invests in the public good, in people, in communities, and the environment, and addresses other social ills. It inoculates against the vast economic, social, and political costs of unemployment. The job guarantee is cheaper than the basic income. The estimated cost is 1.5 to 3% of gross domestic product. The projected gross domestic product figure for Canada for 2020, according to the 2019 federal budget, is $2 trillion, 379 billion. At a rate of 1.5 of GDP, the job guarantee would cost 34 billion for Canada. For PEI, the GDP is $7.6 billion, and at 1.5, it would cost 114 million. The job guarantee permanently reduces welfare expenditures and permanently increases real GDP. In the USA, it would increase the GDP by 500 to 600 billion annually, and it would also permanently increase private sector jobs. It has an insignificant impact on inflation and reduces invisible social costs. It would be paid for by the federal government, the keeper of the public purse.
We believe that a job guarantee is an effective way of eradicating poverty and giving back to society. A good example given by Dr. Chuneva is that women with children, they often want to work part-time. The job guarantee gives them that option. It gives them more time to spend with their children and to keep their hand in work. If they prefer to work full-time, childcare is written in as a benefit. In Argentina, a job guarantee program employed 5% of the population, 13% of the labor force, in a program for heads of households. In the evaluation, 90% of the participants stated that they are satisfied. All said they prefer the job guarantee to the Bolsa Familia, Brazil's version of a basic income, which was introduced into Argentina by the World Bank. Child care, as we noted, was not an obstacle because it was integrated into the project. In the end, the participants scored their experience as followed. Number 1, I can do something. Number 2, I work in a good environment. Number 3, I help the community. Number 4, I learn. And number 5, I have income. Participants preferred the job guarantee to the basic income. There are various reasons why people want to work, and it's not just out of income necessity.
The job guarantee differs from a basic income in several key comparisons. For example, the job guarantee has a stabilizer. The basic income has no price stabilizer and no immediate direct production of output. There is no obvious human capital enhancement. The job guarantee has a training component to transition people to working, including jobs in the new economy and jobs that are part of the transition into the greening of the economy. This can be done fairly quickly. People who would not be trained for jobs that do not exist People considered unemployable would be helped into a job. The job guarantee would assist current workers to transition out of jobs that are going to be obsolete and into new economy with the skills they need. Jobs are not disappearing. The nature of work is changing. Canada currently needs 1 million jobs. Many institutions in the caring sector are understaffed, and businesses have spare space as well. The job guarantee is an effective plan that moves us forward and gets us there. The message is uplifting as it shows what is possible in the future: more jobs, higher wages, good growth rates as opposed to polluting growth, and a brighter outlook on the future. The minimum wage with the job guarantee becomes de facto a minimum wage, according to Dr. Kelton. There is no reason why we should be neglecting a large percentage of people who want to work.
Another important consideration is that the BEI is discretionary, and discretionary programs can be cut. By writing a check, you are replacing mandatory programs with discretionary programs. Would the 41 Canadian billionaires spend their check in the economy, or would they invest it to increase their wealth? As far as inequality, it is harder for governments to undermine the job guarantee because people are working and earning. A review of the literature tells us that worldwide there are only a handful of basic income programs. In Britain, experts responding to the Labour Party study on a basic income found it very expensive if set at £120 a week. The country would have to raise an additional 20% of national income taxes, costing $400 billion a year, according to the Financial Times. Anna Coote, a principal fellow of the New Economics Foundation, co-author of Universal Basic Income, A Union Perspective, concluded in an article in The Guardian on May 6 that, quote, a study of UBI trials concluded that making cash payments to all is no solution to poverty and inequality. After studying 16 practical projects that have tested different ways of distributing regular cash payments to individuals across a range of poor, middle income, and rich countries, as well as abundant literature on the topic. It could find no evidence to suggest that such a scheme could be sustained for all individuals in any country in the short, medium, or longer term, or that this approach could achieve lasting improvements in well-being and equity.
In Kenya, people in 120 villages receive $22 per month for some 12 years. Some for 2 years, but there is no way to generalize the results. It is funded by UNICEF and a U.S. charity called Give Directly. There is no evidence about the long-term viability or how the program could be scaled up to serve the whole population. And there's a democratic deficit. People have no control over how payments are made, to whom, at what level, or over what period of time. The basic income in India is $100 US a year and is privately funded. The Alaska Permanent Fund is $1,600 a year, but has done little to reduce child poverty or to prevent widening of income inequalities. It has had some positive impacts on rural indigenous groups. In Brazil, the Bolsa Familia is a social welfare program. The money is spent in order of priority on food, school supplies, clothing, and shoes. It has had an impact on poverty, school attendance rates, and the number of children involved in the child labor. It has helped boost nutrition and diet quality, and some schools offer 1 free meal a day and 2 in poorer areas. This program has had an important impact on children. In Finland, the experience of offering $541.82 monthly to 2,000 unemployed workers, which would replace their social benefits, was suspended by a government after 1 year. The International Labour Office estimates that the average cost of the basic income are equivalent to 20 to 30% of GDP in most countries. With lower payments to reduce costs, there is no evidence that a practical, conditional UBI scheme could do anything to mitigate, let alone reverse trends towards worsening poverty, inequality, and labor insecurity. Offsetting costs by raising taxes or shifting expenditures from other kinds of public expenditures are huge and risky trade-offs. If cash payments are allowed to take precedence, there is serious risk of crowding out efforts to build collaborative, sustainable services and infrastructure, and setting a pattern for the future development that promotes commodification rather than emancipation, and this is why Silicon Valley supports a UBI. The report calls for more and better public services, something supported by Armin Yalnizyan, former senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, who sees the basic income as a market approach. The International Labour Organization report concludes that collective provision offers more cost-effective, socially just, redistributive, and sustainable way of meeting people's needs than leaving individuals to buy what they can afford in the marketplace.
Armin Yalnizyan reminds us that, quote, for the past 20 years, government put a priority on tax cuts as a way to put money in your pocket. A basic income does the same thing as an income transfer. Like tax cuts, which can be broad-based or targeted and provide large and small amounts, more money in your pocket doesn't change the status quo in the market. Your cash, received as an individual, doesn't create another unit of affordable housing or create one new childcare space. Having said all this, we want to be clear that we support funding for people with disabilities at a level that meets their basic needs. We also support funding for people on social assistance at a level that meets their basic needs. Some of this support could be provided with a strengthened social safety net. We support universal child care as well and are pleased that it would be an integral part of the job guarantee. Finally, the purpose of presenting this information today is to acknowledge that we are all seriously seeking a way to eradicate poverty. It would be wrong to say there is a silver bullet that will solve this problem. The basic income is only one tool in the whole poverty eradication toolbox. Please be open to other suggestions, such as the job guarantee. We are asking this committee to examine all the alternatives. The Child Poverty Report Cards make several recommendations for reducing and eradicating poverty. One of the main ones is to increase the Canada Child Benefit so that in combination with a proposed new benefit called the Dignity Dividend, that's a GST rebate of $1,800 per year for every child and adult, the target of a 50% reduction in child care by 2025 could be achieved. Government should ensure access to the benefit for families living at higher rates of poverty, such as First Nations families, unreserved, children whose parents have irregular immigration status, and women in shelters fleeing violence. And just to say that those people are not covered right now, so they should be. It would achieve a 50% reduction in poverty rates in these communities by 2025. We need to remember that the Sustainable Development Goals require that poverty must be eradicated by 2030, less than 10 years from now. So we thank you for allowing us to share our concerns and our comments with you today. I know we didn't follow your parameters, but I think we said from the beginning that it would be very difficult for us to follow those parameters. And I think you know why. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You referenced several reports in that presentation, very thorough referencing list. I'm wondering if you're able to provide those reports, not at this moment, but to send it along to the committee after this meeting.
We have our talks here. We should have given them to you so you could follow along. Sorry about that.
No, that's
Would you like to have them now?
Give you a copy of what we said.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, perfect, thank you. All right, so we'll open the floor to questions. Who would like to start? I have a couple of questions to start. So you mentioned that this would be a federally funded and administered locally program. So considering the scope of this committee providing recommendations to the provincial government, to the legislature, sorry, at a provincial level, what do you feel might be done at a provincial level at this point without federal involvement?
Well, that's a difficult one because the job guarantee says it could be administered at the municipal level and the provincial level. So the province would be administering it, but it would be federally paid. So I think the province would have a big role in creating jobs, and it's a bottom-up plan. It's not a top-down plan. So the province would have a big responsibility in knowing and creating and working together with everybody else to create those kinds of jobs, and of course it would involve certain organizations as well. I don't know if that answers your question, does it?
Thank you. We'll go to Gord McNeely.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It's just, it's great to hear and all the good work that you've done over the years. Dr. Stephanie Kelton, what university was she?
Stony Brook University. I think that's in New York State.
Okay. And this, what I'm trying to do is figure out all the work that we did thus far, and what you're proposing here. Does Skills PEI, like, it seems like Skills PEI over the last 4 or 5 years has kind of touched into this kind of area with job development, employee relationships, subsidies. Would that be touching on some of this? Are you familiar with any other programs?
Well, this would be a public job pool, which I think is different from assisting employers, which is the private sector. It doesn't omit the private sector, but it has room for, like when they were estimating, I think that they would start with creating in the US about 15 million jobs, and there would be 4 million something private sector jobs along with that. So the two are not at odds with each other, but they would not be in favor of just supplementing the private sector or those kinds of programs and rely on them to create the jobs. These are socially productive, socially necessary jobs, and there's so many of them in health and environment, in there's many needs gaps that do exist. So the training would take on a different character, because if you're unemployed and you want to work part-time or full-time, you would make that known. And then with the job pool, you would be given a selection of jobs that are in that pool. And you would suggest then which one of those jobs would be the one that would best suit you and your talents and what you want to do. And you would be given training in that job for those skills. Now, you wouldn't be caught forever in that job either. If you wanted to, probably you would work out of that into a higher paying or a better job as time went by, because there is also a very strong human development component. But I think the thing that's really important in this is that being trained to fit a certain job rather than being trained and finishing and not having a job. This would offer you the security that you're going to go out of that training into a job. Is that?
Yeah, that's great. No, and I was just thinking out loud to figure out what we have and how we could administer it. That's great, and I like this because it motivates people and gets people contributing, and you know, that's one of the major factors. what would be, is there some links, what we're talking about here today and the BIG, like a hybrid? Like how could we look at, because this committee is, we're trying to get a report ready, and is there some hybrid links to what you're suggesting to what we're working on as well?
Well, I don't know how that would work because they are two different programs. There's some relationship, you know, in the sense that if you were a person who couldn't work or felt that at this point in your life you didn't want to work, you wouldn't be left out in the cold. You would still be covered with your expenses while you went through that period and found your way out of that. But no, I don't know. That's why we had problems from the beginning about why was this committee only concentrating on the basic income? Why weren't we given alternatives and options so that we would find the right way? We have real trouble with the fact that the alternatives are not there. So trying to combine these two, they're different in nature. They really are different in nature, but not unrelated in some ways. That's about as far as we could go with that.
Gord, did you have another question?
Yeah, just one more. You mentioned the LIM. You like the poverty measure of LIM. Could you talk a little bit about that? Why that one would be preferred again?
Yes, we have. It's especially with the organizations that have worked on the child poverty report card, and we find that the LIM has, to us, the most accurate assessment of the extent of poverty, and that the market basket measure underestimates the extent of poverty. And I think I have an example here of that. See, with the market basket measure too, it's taken in 50 different communities in Canada, so you can't compare so easily province to province, and you can't compare Canada to the international scene, which is another very important comparison because we are falling well behind the OECD countries in the way that we are approaching and eradicating poverty. So we would see the market basket measure more as a supplementary to the LIM. And it's because we have a graph here showing that there's a huge gap, like where the LIM says that the child poverty rate in Canada is 18.6%, the market basket measure puts it at 9%. And that's a huge difference. So now we do know that the market basket measure has been updated a bit recently, but still not enough, and I think there might be another update coming. It doesn't measure poverty on reserves. And for the Indigenous people, this is a huge thing that has to be, I think they're looking at that, but that's a huge oversight, especially in Canada today and what we're experiencing. So it's a lower measure, but because it's in 50 communities across the country as a supplementary to the LIM, it would be great because it would give a much better picture of what's going on community to community across the country, and that would be good.
All right. Hannah Bell.
Thank you, Chair. And my apologies for joining you late. There's a bit of a number of different things happening. I have had the opportunity, though, to go through them. The first thing I'd like to do is thank you very much for your work on the annual child poverty reports, which are a valuable resource that we use to develop policy in our office and have been a reliable and really useful source of information. So I wanted to mention that. A couple of quick things, though, that I really need to speak to that you've just mentioned. One is regarding the market basket measure. You're the only organisation that we've heard from, and every single one that's presented, that didn't recognise the market basket measure as a useful tool for measuring poverty. And obviously it's a tool, but I would like to clarify that the market basket measure has been recently updated as with 2019 numbers, and that there is a very specific and accurate measure for 3 measures for PEI, which benchmark market basket measure for individuals, families, and combined families in Charlottetown, in communities of under 30,000 that are not urban, and in rural. And those have been actually used to establish social assistance rates and align with the national poverty strategy. So those are considerations in terms of when we look at what measures we use is obviously we recognize that there are a number out there and they're used for different ways, but we also need to look at what is the common language and the common measures. But I really wanted to get on record that there is a very recent and accurate set of measures which have been which benchmark specifically for PEI in the context of Canada and on an international basis. Saying that, though, obviously we see LICO and LIM showing up in a number of other places around economic benchmarking. In this case, though, for this committee, we are specifically looking about measures that allow us to meet the commitment of eliminating poverty. And one of my major concerns when we talk about what was not in that mandate of this committee, which is a job guarantee, is that the core mandate for eliminating poverty is that all islanders deserve to live in security and dignity, regardless of their circumstances. And one of the key pieces that we've heard about over and over is how important it is that when we think about a program that supports and something that works towards that goal, that it does not have conditionality as part of its structure. We are really clear that connecting, or it has, I certainly feel that it has been clear, or that we could draw a very clear conclusion from what we've heard to this point, that, including from those with lived experience, that connecting the availability of support and programs to someone's capacity to work is a condition which is inappropriate to address the needs of the broadest range of islanders. For example, people who live with disabilities make up 65% of the population of those who are permanently on social assistance. They are not able to enter the workforce in a way that we would recognize, or at all, that we would recognize as something that matches an employment program. If you can let me finish speaking, please. And I would be very, very careful about making a connection that says that you can only be eligible for a program that assesses and addresses poverty if you meet certain conditions, because we are excluding the people who may need it the most. And that has been a recurring theme of basic income or universal income. And so I really would like to speak specifically about how a job guarantee program, which absolutely has a fantastic approach, and I see this as, to my colleague's point, as being something that we should do, but not in its isolation from the need to support, for example, people who have a fundamental need for basic support that has nothing to do with their ability to work. So perhaps you could speak to the how this program would really help assist people who are unable to enter the workforce because of something like a disability.
I'd like to say, first of all, that there are no conditions on this. There are no conditions, so, and we agree there should not be conditions, so this is, I think...
But I would suggest that if you're making this conditional to someone being able to work, that's a condition.
No, it's a job pool, and people who want to work. When people want to work, yes, of course, we know that HIDs, that with social assistance, that is 65% of people on social assistance, the HIDs of those households are unable to work. But they have disabilities, but there could be a time when they would say, rather than sitting at home, maybe there's a job in the job pool that I could do for a few hours a day. I could get out of the house. I could do something in the community. I could mix with people. I could socialize. I could do these things. That's what the job pool will be there for. It's not a condition thing at all. It says if you are looking for a job, if you don't want to be unemployed, if you want to have dignity, the dignity that work gives you, as well as other things give you dignity. But if you want these things, there's a job pool, and come to us and we will try to suit and fit you in there. We're not saying to go out. It's not make work or any work fair or any of those things. We're not telling people to go out and get a job. We're saying there's a job pool of socially useful needs, and if you want to work, here's where you can come. And if you don't, we will take care of you. And we made it clear in our presentation that we support people with disabilities having their needs met, fully, and the same with people on social assistance and people who need assistance. We have no problem, and I agree with you 100% about conditionalities. We don't want them either. They shouldn't be there.
Thank you for that clarification. And I want to just take a minute to note as well, something that we have heard in presentations and that I think is coming forward today is that a basic income would not replace all other programs, that some other supports would still need to be in place for certain people who are facing certain challenges. And this might be an interesting thing to look at in terms of, as you mentioned, you would want to have supports for people who wouldn't be working for a period of time or didn't feel they were able to enter the labor force for whatever reasons. I believe you did mention that. So I think that that's, acknowledging that, there would be ideally a floor below which nobody would fall, but what you're proposing is that there be some program that provides a list of jobs or helps match people up with work, should they so choose. This is what I'm understanding from your presentation.
Yes.
Carl?
Yes, and with disabilities too, just because someone has a disability doesn't mean they can't do anything, because there's different disabilities. And some people with disabilities could find jobs in there that they could do. Just because they're disabled from doing one type of work, lifting or something, doesn't mean they can't do another type of work. And if they found something there, that would make them productive. But along with a lot of this basic income, or guaranteed income, a lot of places where they put the programs in, they've failed. And they've failed because they haven't removed the barriers. They haven't provided affordable childcare and stuff like this. So if you cut the program off without having transportation for people to get jobs, affordable daycare and that type of thing, how is your program going to succeed? And
I think there are certainly some points there that, affordable childcare and transportation, that have also come up most certainly. I'm not sure we could say based on the evidence that other pilots have failed. We've been looking into all of that. But I think that there are a range of things to consider in a basic income, most certainly. Hannah, did you have more questions?
I'll just follow up, and it connects to, I think the point, thank you very much for your point, Chair, that one of the things that we have been doing throughout the extensive work of this committee is exploring how programs can realistically be implemented and how they would fit into sort of existing structures and or replace existing structures. So that's a really important point. A couple of quick things on that as a follow-up. One is that obviously there are not only existing job programs through the Labour Market Development Agreement, but there is actually an organisation who has an entire section of their mandate is to find work for people who have disabilities who choose to work or are able to work, and that's the PEI Council of People with Disabilities, who actually have full-time employment offices already do that work. I think the other thing that we've talked about a lot in this committee and in many other committees is the importance of language. And I think when we use words like won't work, rather than can't work, we have to be very careful about the implication that says about presumptions that we may be making about people's abilities. I have spent a long time working with the community of people with disabilities, and I'd be very clear, there are many people who would like to work if they can, and that is not a choice that they are able to make. So we have to ensure that programs recognize the lived experience of those which is not ours. And so the language that we use when we speak about a community that's not ours is incredibly important. And I would really like to be clear on that, Chair. My point, I think the other one in this is there's a couple of comments in your presentation regarding the fact that a basic income guarantee wouldn't be permanent. Whereas potentially, so the program piece, one of the things that we are talking about here is exactly that risk, and it's been in previous presentations of a pilot is potentially really risky and potentially damaging because it could be pulled. And so part of this is to hopefully design something which inherently replaces and fixes the gaps that are in the system. So that's exactly what the Chair mentioned earlier, which is where are the gaps that we can address, what needs to remain to layer onto that, and how do we embed that so that it is now a new part of our new reality for our social systems. I would again put forward to you that in that context, a job program is a part of a suite of programs that would go hand in hand, but the core function of this work we're doing is about security and dignity for all islanders without conditionality, and I would strongly argue that that still remains ensuring that base level is there, and then we build on top of that. So, for example, when somebody does want to enter the workforce, there is targeted support there for them, rather than the condition being that they must be able to or want to work. Thank you, Chair.
Did you wish to respond?
I just want to say, a couple of things. Well, first of all, I want to ask about, are there trade-offs in what's being proposed now? Because we're very strong about increasing and strengthening the social safety net, not limiting programs. And as we study on the basic income, in many places they say that part of paying for the basic income would be to eliminate certain programs that exist. And this could be bad. It could be a mistake to do that. I think the direction that most people are taking with their concern for eradicating poverty is that strengthening the social safety net. In doing that, we can't go wrong as a province or a country. And therefore, that takes priority over everything else. So we would hope that here that there would be no thought of eliminating any of the social programs to pay for a basic income if you decide that that's what you're going to do. We wouldn't necessarily agree with you doing that, but if you decide to, we only have so much power, and that's, I guess, what we have today to communicate here to you. Another thing I'd like to mention, is speaking of language back and forth, and we have to sometimes, you're speaking off the cuff, and you might use a word that you regret. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but I do want to say when you're doing the report, there's something that bothers me all the time, and that is it comes from some kind of a model or a methodology that was describing justice, well, long-term and short-term, and they unfortunately put it into two shoes. Long-term would be justice, and short-term would be charity. And that has made, in many ways, charity a kind of a bad word, and I find that offensive because charity is a fine Christian virtue, and it's related very much to justice. And instead of saying, okay, short-term Band-Aid types of solutions don't work, some people say charity doesn't work. I'd like to make sure that we don't use that expression in the writing because it just doesn't fit, and it's short-term Band-Aid, and it has nothing to do with charity as such, except that people want to do something in a crisis. And here's a good example, establish a food bank in the early 80s in a crisis, and now it's an institution. How do we change that? How do we solve that problem, It should never become an institution, but it is. And so we, as you can see, we're very, very interested in the job guarantee, which we think is not supplementary at all to a basic income. We don't see it as supplementary. We see it as a program in its own right, and as I said, there are some relationships to the basic income, and the fact that nobody under these programs would go and want, which is very, very important, that workers would in the workforce you can imagine all the different workers who are working under terrible conditions and who would like to see better conditions, better wages, all kinds of things, and they don't see them. And the other thing that's important about it is that it is a living wage, and that's why we too would like to hear Christine Saulnier, because we believe that hopefully she has been able to work out a living wage for PEI, and we congratulate you on choosing her to do that, because that's very, very important for us and as a gauge, for poverty eradication.
And just to clarify, we have engaged Dr. Saulnier to present to the committee, so she's not. We did not, contract her to do that work, but we'll see what she presents us with.
Yes.
Absolutely looking forward to that
Yes.
presentation as well. Hopefully we can get the technical side in place. Sunny, you had some questions.
Thank you, Chair. Just more of a comment. Thank you very much, Mary Boyd and Carol Percy, for your presentation. Certainly enlightening to hear another suggestion, like job guarantee versus basic income guarantee. And, as you know, the committee is struck with measures of poverty and living wages, and this is a good other avenue to look at, and it gives us something to think about. To your points about what other services are going to be eliminated, if there is any, we're not there yet, I don't believe, as a committee. We still have to cost this out, which is coming down the road, but I certainly thank you very much for your presentation today, and it gives us one more thing to think about. Thank you very much.
No questions? Okay. Right. Anybody else?
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much for presenting today and for sharing these ideas. As I mentioned, if you do have reports for us to have a look at, that's always helpful. This committee takes that away and takes the time to look through those reports in consideration of its recommendations. So I do encourage you to send those along to Sean if you can, either in paper form or digital. And thank you again. So we will take a brief recess while we switch over to Dr. Saulnier.
Hi.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so I have the montage behind you so you can't see that and see me. Can you see the montage? You can't see
Yes.
me? Okay, can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
I can so far. So
Okay.
we're gonna let the committee settle again and then we'll take it back and they'll give you the floor. So fingers crossed.
Okay.
Okay.
She's muted.
All right, so we believe we have worked out the technical issues, so everybody keep your fingers crossed, because we are absolutely looking forward to this presentation from Dr. Saulnier, specifically around living wage framework and what that might look like here in PEI. So I will now hand over the floor to Dr. Saulnier.
Okay, thanks so much. Hope this works out.
So far, so good.
Okay, good. So I wanted to just start by telling you what my involvement was, but I will move into telling you how the living wage is calculated and why we calculate it the way that we do. So I first authored the first report in Atlantic Canada in June of 2015. How's the sound? Okay, good. It's not so great for me. There's a bit of feedback, but it's good for you. We'll keep going. Okay, so I did the first calculation in Halifax in 2015, and we did that in partnership with the United Way here, and there's a full report explaining how we did that. But we really did follow the Canadian Living Wage Framework, and in fact, it was our colleagues in the BC office of my organization that really kickstarted this work in Canada around 2008. And that work informed the development of the Canadian Living Wage Framework. So I will just go through, what is a living wage as it's developed in Canada? How do we actually calculate it and why? First, I'd say this, the living wage is a really important benchmark wage. Indeed, it's a benchmark income. If you're looking at, as you are as a committee, looking at wage levels, trying to figure out what that means, maybe you're comparing it to median or average wages, maybe you're comparing to other cities in Canada or other provinces, or in fact, you're looking at low income measures or poverty lines. For the living wage, there are three things that definitely set it apart as a benchmark. First, it considers the actual costs that a wage should cover for workers in a specific community. Second, the hourly rate of pay that we calculate is designed to also consider the entire package of wages and benefits. So, for example, if an employer provides additional health coverage or paid vacation, then this could actually lower the hourly rate of pay required to pay a living wage. And the third part is, the third thing that kind of sets it apart is that the rate of pay takes into consideration directly government programs and benefits that assist earners to make ends meet. So when we figure out what the gross employment wage is, we arrive at that living wage by considering what the actual take-home pay or the annual income will be. So it needs to cover reasonable expenses, and I'll tell you what we consider reasonable. It needs to also consider what's deducted from that paycheck. That's income tax and payroll taxes. But it also considers whether there are government subsidies or income transfers and social programs. So something like a $10 a day childcare program would be considered in the calculation of a living wage and would actually mean that the private paycheck needs to be less for families that have childcare. So and I'll get into this a little bit more, but to be clear, the way that the living wage movement has been developed in Canada, it is not a minimum wage in the sense that it's not legislated and it's not a legal requirement that the government has imposed anywhere in our country. In fact, it's not really possible. It's not meant to be the floor or the minimum, but they're complementary. And ideally, the minimum, of course, reflects and is set at something that is livable for workers. And as you know, this is what you're studying, a living wage is not a guaranteed basic income. While a guaranteed basic income sets an income floor, it is entirely publicly and government funded. Again, the living wage annual income amount could serve as important information as you think about what the amount of that floor might be, how generous your clawbacks are, etc. What a living wage is, as it's been developed in Canada, is it's really a voluntary commitment that both public and private employers make to pay their staff and their contracted service staff. So in some provinces and indeed countries, the UK, for example, and in the US, there are certification programs that develop. So these are like similar to something like a fair trade certification, but this is a living wage certification program. And in BC, you see about 150 employers currently who are certified, and a growing number in Ontario where there's been certification programs for a while. And who's been certified? You can look at the list, but they include private companies, small, medium, large, nonprofits, cooperatives, public institutions, so that includes school boards and hospitals, as well as local governments. So 5 municipal governments in BC, including Vancouver, have been certified as living wage employers. Now, that's different than what's happened in some places in the United States. Just to be clear, you can't have a geographic ordinance in Canada outside of the way that we set the provincial minimum wages. You can't say Charlottetown will have X living wage, which is something that has been done in the United States. That's kind of how it's been developed. Now, I'm going to move to explaining how we calculate it. The work in BC, as I said, did inform the development of the Canadian Living Wage Framework. That framework is available at livingwagecanada.ca. You can have a look at the entire document. And I will also say, if you look at the policyalternatives.ca website, you go to the Nova Scotia office or the BC office, you will find the living wage calculations. So when we release a calculation of a living wage, we also BC and I have in Atlantic Canada put up the Excel spreadsheets. So you can have a look at how we've actually calculated this. This is full transparency so that people understand how we're coming up with these numbers. So the framework itself was developed so that we can ensure a consistency in terms of how we define what a living wage is, how we calculate it, so the methodology, and also a strategy around recognizing living wage employers. So aside from the definition and methodology, the framework outlines what the principles are upon which we have built the calculations. So as I mentioned, the living wage does reflect what earners need to bring home based on the actual costs in their community. And the living wage is designed to ensure that a full-time paid earner is lifted out of poverty. However, it is not a poverty line wage. So it's not keeping people kind of hovering just above a poverty line or at a poverty line. That risks people falling back in, and it likely means that people won't be breaking the cycle of poverty. So the living wage is really calculated to ensure there's a bit of a buffer above the poverty line. And if you know the research and evidence around the impact of poverty on health, you know that one of the main pathways is really the toll that the stress takes when you're living in poverty. And getting at that stress requires us ensuring there's safety and security, right? That there's this kind of buffer. So the living wage is really designed to ensure that workers have a chance to not just work to exist, right? That you're not just kind of running in place, but that workers have a decent quality of life. So some of the principles, and you can have a look at the framework, but I will outline them. The living wage is calculated to promote social inclusion. So that's ensuring that people can actively participate in their community, whether civic, social, or cultural. It's designed to support healthy child development principles, again, recognizing that families need to be able to provide all that's required for their children, and ensuring that families are not under this severe financial stress. It is also calculated at a level where it's still conservative and reasonable, and I will talk a little bit more about that. So as we figure out how to calculate the wage, one of the questions was, in order to come up with a monthly budget, you have to have a reference family, so a reference household. The choice was made to have a 2
adult earners and 2 children as the reference household. That means the reference family would need to have enough income to cover their monthly budgets. Once we consider government transfers and those deductions, and we file their taxes to make sure that they have enough income to cover all their expenses. What that really means is the wage is enough for a family of 4 if both adult earners earn this living wage, hourly wage, working full-time, full year. But it also means that an adult earner working full-time for the full year will also be able to cover their expenses. And the reason, I won't get in too deep into the reasons around the reference household and how it's been tested, but what the tests have shown is that the reference household ensures that the costs in the budget and the wage that we come out with does cover the diversity of families in our community and accounts for changes across the life cycle. So, the decision was made certainly not to come up with a wage, say, for a single earner versus a family earner versus a single parent. You don't want to have people kind of looking at something that will end up discriminating against certain earners. But we wanted to make sure that if we can have a wage that ensures that at least the most diversity of families have enough, then that's a good wage. We also have looked at it in terms of the life cycle. So one of the most significant expenses for families with children is definitely childcare, and that is included in the budget. But one of the discussions around the living wage is and justifications for the family is that, of course, childcare is not the only expense for families, but that childcare expense allows some flexibility in the budget for other earners. It also allows flexibility for the family, whether they need to be can be shifting into saving for post-secondary education, because that's a safeguard against poverty for the next generation. So it really is trying to think through what our goals are in terms of providing this decent quality of life. For the one earner, it's absolutely sufficient, even though, there's not some economies of scale. You have one earner earning full-time living wage. It is enough. A lone parent with one child, it also will cover. It, in many jurisdictions, will cover a single parent with 2 children. Depends on the cost of the childcare and what programs they get access to. The same is true for 2 earners with more than 2 young kids, right? So the way that the living wage is calculated is really in the context of what is available in your community. And the main part of that is figuring out the costs for the living wage budget. I won't get into numbers, but I will tell you what is included in the budget and explain how it kind of fits with the principles. And all I'll say about the data is many of the costs are drawn from Statistics Canada's market basket measure. For example, the clothing and footwear costs is drawn from that. Others are drawn from Canada Mortgage Housing. If a cost is not available in published research data, then we do community surveys. So we want to make sure that we are capturing what it costs to live in a specific community. So the 6 items that I think everybody would agree are essential: food, clothing and footwear, shelter, utilities, transportation, are all part of the budget. And then we include childcare because that is the reference family. And there are other expenses that are included as well. The total is 11. We include healthcare, and what we mean by healthcare and how we calculate that is we know that there are many holes in our public healthcare system. We include the very basic cost of additional health insurance. So in Land Canada, it's usually a basic Blue Cross. We also include a tiny budget for parental education. Again, recognizing that we're talking mostly about low-wage workers, enabling them to do their GED or to do some upgrading. We've included a little bit in the budget. There is a contingency amount. Again, we want to ensure that there is a buffer. One of the things we know about people living in poverty, it's often and not just people living in poverty, of course, but definitely people living in poverty, the paycheck to paycheck. Any emergencies means sometimes people lose their houses, right? So we want to make sure that there's a little buffer. We've included 2 weeks pay per parent for the year, and that's designated as an emergency fund, which is not a lot, but is, again, a bit of a buffer. The last two budget items, one is household expenses. I was struck, so one of the things I'd say is when we do this calculation the first time in any community, we have focus groups with low-wage workers, and we talk to them about their lives currently and maybe what it would mean to earn a living wage. One of the things that strikes us is both on the household expenses and on the social inclusion, how difficult it is for both those things. One, for the household expenses, that's personal care. Often we think these things are necessities, but maybe not essential. I would perhaps argue that they are likely essential. But it also includes household supplies, which we don't think about, and furniture as needed. So things in the household that may not come under food, under very specific essentials. The other very important category, given how the living wage is calculated and designed, is something we've called social inclusion. And that really is a category that is to get at the stigma, that is to allow low-wage workers to participate fully in the community. And this covers school supplies, reading materials, minimal recreation and sports fees. One of the things we hear from low-wage workers who are parents is, sometimes they can't even afford a gift for their children. If their child is invited to a birthday party, they don't have funds to, they won't send their kid because they don't have money to buy them a gift. The kinds of things that allow people to make choices to be able to be included in our community is what we have designated a social inclusion budget, but we haven't said how they spend it. How they spend it is really up to them. And after we have kind of tested the budget with our workers, and set up the spreadsheet, we are able to calculate the hourly wage. So I want to give you a sense of where that level comes out, and I've just included some numbers in Atlantic Canada. You can look across the country, and that is one of the great things about using the framework. So in 2018, which is the last time we calculated in Halifax, the living wage here was $19 an hour. We've calculated wages also in Antigonish, which is in Nova Scotia, a smaller town in Nova Scotia, and their living wage came out at $17.75 an hour. We have also calculated the wage in St. John, New Brunswick, and that wage came out at $18.18 an hour. And the very last community that we calculated in 2019 was St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador. Their wage came out at $18.85 an hour. And just so you can understand, if I use the St. John's hourly rate, the gross annual income for one full-time earner, that's an adult working 35 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, they would need $34,307 in gross annual income. So you'll see that is not a poverty wage. This is a wage that would allow a decent quality of life. Having said that, if we think about what's included in the budget, there are many things that are not included. Debt repayment. I don't know anybody who doesn't have debt. Retirement savings beyond CPP, that's not included. There's no life insurance. There's certainly no provision in the budget for mortgage payments or savings to own a home. And perhaps most importantly, the assumption around the reference family and around the earners is that they are all healthy and able-bodied, and that they are not caring for anybody who needs additional special care, right? So none of that is in the budget. That's kind of where we come out in terms of the hourly wage. One of the advantages of us having come a little late to the game in the sense that living wages that had been calculated in the UK, in the US for decades before Canada started calculating, is there is a fair amount of evidence in both those jurisdictions that show what happens. And a lot of that evidence is actually firm level. That means, so companies, big companies like, I'm trying to think of the company, the big accounting firm in the UK did evaluations. So they said, okay, we're going to come on as a living wage employer and we're going to evaluate what happens. And the research is quite, I mean, in one sense, it's what we think. If we really think about what it means to be living in poverty and to be coming to work, and what it would mean if we actually provided a living wage to people and that buffer. So for employees, obviously it means more income, and we see what impact that has. Employees report having better mental health. Their morale improves, their productivity improves, they take fewer sick days, and they are more loyal to their employers. So the impact then on their employers, those who paid a living wage, obviously you're looking at improved job quality and productivity and better service delivery, lower absenteeism, decreased employee turnover, which in the end, of course, saves employers money in terms of staff hiring and training. And employers also talk about the reputational benefits. If they are known as a living wage employer, not only are there some clients and customers that may frequent their business because of that certification, but they also see that employees or potential employees, so applicants, they have seen a better quality in terms of kind of who is willing or looking to the employer to actually work there. And I'm just going to conclude, and then we can have questions. So what I'd say is, you know, I do work on poverty reduction and poverty eradication. And what we know is we're trying to get at that gap between, in this case, we're looking at workers. So what people earn and what it takes to make ends meet. The living wage absolutely assumes that labor market wages is a necessary contributor to solve the problems of poverty, but that government-funded benefits play a critical role. So the way that it's calculated really shows where the partnership is. And when it works, it really does support our community and our workers. By using the Canadian Living Wage Framework to calculate, it means that not only do we see what the real-time costs are for a family in a specific community, we can consider what the most significant costs are and what we could do to lower them. We can compare across jurisdictions in Canada, in particular, because most of the communities are using the living wage framework. Not only can you compare costs, which is illuminating, to see, for example, how high food costs are in Atlantic Canada compared to many jurisdictions in the rest of Canada, as an example. You can compare taxes, but you can also compare transfer programs and other programs across the country and really see what happens when, depending on what the eligibility requirement is for a program. What we've seen in Atlantic Canada is, even though there are some programs that might be helping some families, most of the eligibility levels are much too low. So our living wage families and earners don't qualify for them. So it doesn't actually help them very much. So by using the living wage framework, you can kind of say, okay, what can be done? What could we do at the local level, at the community level, at the provincial level, and also at the federal level? The living wage is really one of our tools to assist low-wage workers. I want to underline that it's certainly not a substitute for a higher minimum wage or stronger labor standards or stronger enforcement of those standards. And of course, I know what you're discussing is improving income supports, not just for those who are in the labor market. And we need to ensure that, we are also looking at decreasing the barriers to people who are not in the labor market as you move forward with your very important work. And if I could, I just say two more things and then I'm done. Obviously, addressing poverty is about income first and foremost. It's about how we can support people so they have adequate income. But we must also ensure that we are addressing the affordable housing that's lacking in communities, and the, childcare spaces, the drugs, making them more accessible and affordable. And one caution around, and I don't know where you are in terms of your basic income decisions, is that it not be a pilot that's testing whether this will save government money. That is a caution that I would just kind of red flag for you. I know some people use that as a reason to consider what kind of income supports we could provide. I've looked at some of those numbers. Our economists have crunched some of those numbers. And actually, we know that income assistance itself is actually rather efficient. The problems, of course, are it's not generous, it's punitive, and it's not supportive. I would also caution that providing income supports via the tax system doesn't substitute for good public policy. People don't fit into boxes. I'm hearing lots of issues, even just around the Canada Child Benefit, a wonderful government transfer. But if you are not able to access people who understand what is happening in your life, you're talking to a tax expert, that is definitely not the same as being able to access someone like a social worker or a supportive worker in the community. Basic income and providing sufficient income, of course, will get at the poverty. And we need to do that. We need to ensure that we're getting at the stress that comes from that poverty. But the state of our public services means we will be needing to fill in some of those gaps as you move forward. So you might be able to more effectively use your resources. That's different than saving, and perhaps investing in the things that I mentioned, or the education piece, the post-secondary education, or the housing. And my last, as someone who does gender analysis and thinks about what the impact of policies are, one of the things about the living wage is that it does actually bring it to the fore the gender equality question. We know that more of our low-wage workers are women, and actually more of our low-wage workers are racialized. I am concerned that we ensure that we're addressing some of the public services as we move forward, and not simply conscripting women to take a small amount of income to do things that should be done by professionals in long-term care or home care. That there is actually some options, that we are looking at decreasing the barriers to the labor force, and ensuring that the benefits are high enough that people with disabilities get access to what they need, that they aren't isolated, and that we provide incentives for employers to accommodate those who could work, so that we continue to address what some of the issues are in the labor market, and not just think we can kind of sidestep them with a basic income. I think I'll end there and really say that I do commend you and the committee for putting a spotlight on poverty and really seeking the best evidence as you move forward to address it. Thank you.
For that very detailed presentation. That was incredibly helpful, and I know that we'll have many questions from the committee now, so I will open the floor. Who would like to go first? Maybe I'll go first. How about that? Okay. I'm wondering, could you tell me when the Canadian Living Wage Framework was established?
It was after 2008. I don't know exactly what year it went up in its current form.
My follow-up question, how often is it reevaluated? And I'll just say, this sort of comes from some of my previous work. When I was doing some graduate work at the University of Guelph, I helped with the calculation of the living wage in Guelph, more of the qualitative component that you were talking about, so engaging with communities to find out what they consider to be essential for a decent quality of life. So, those sorts of pieces. So I guess I was just wondering, this framework has obviously been developed and tested quite a bit since I was involved with that project. Is there a component still necessary, a qualitative component in calculating a living wage, to look at those pieces around, in a particular community, what are the aspects or the values or the variables that you would need to include?
Yes, I think it is still important to do the qualitative piece. I think the sentiment behind the living wage was really about ensuring that it does respond to the needs of, in particular, low-wage workers. So that those focus groups and the testing with the low-wage workers is absolutely a critical part of the work that needs to happen on the ground. The other part of this is there are a lot of moving parts these days. As your committee knows, the market basket measure is being updated. We've seen a bit of a shift or a significant shift, depending on the jurisdiction, in terms of who low-wage workers are and who is living in poverty. And we've seen on the very positive side some movement to invest in childcare. So I can tell you that the living wage methodology, the National Committee, we are going to be looking very closely at the updated market basket measure, and we are going to be heading into some more testing as we move forward, figuring out the calculations in terms of the reference family in particular, but there are other elements as well that are in question given the changing kind of dynamics of, again, who's living in poverty, considering things like where people are accessing services versus where they work versus where they live, those kinds of questions. So yes.
All right, thank you. And I'm just going to ask one more question before we move on to others in the committee. And this kind of ties into that question around, I know that this is living wage is generally being calculated at a municipal level, not at a provincial level. And I'm thinking about, some of the possible reasons where we might face a challenge in a provincial calculation. Those variables could look very different in different parts, even of this small province. So rural versus urban in terms of transportation. What are your thoughts on, because this committee is mandated looking at a provincial level, how might we best approach a living wage from our perspective?
So I do think that the way that the market basket measure breaks down kind of the bands is perhaps an important way forward. And I should say that's also part of the discussions nationally. So we have some large national employers who are wanting to pay living wages across the country. You absolutely have to do it at the provincial level because taxes and transfers are so different. How many wage levels you need at the community level is still a question mark. We are wanting to continue to test whether the way that the market basket measure breaks down the bands, so you have rural, you have remote, in some provinces you have specific cities that would come out, and is sufficient. And I think what we're learning from especially communities in Ontario, but also some in BC, is that at the end of the day, there isn't a huge difference between the numbers. So I do think the market basket measure does provide some signals around what you might need to do in terms of how many wages, but that's also one of the questions that we're grappling with. We don't want a million different calculations, especially for those employers who work across, they could even work across the province and trying to figure out what to do. But that we want it also to be meaningful to the workers in their community, that it actually reflects what they need, because that's why it was designed in the first place.
Thank you. Hannibal.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple of technical questions just regarding the impact of childcare in the calculation and then the reference family. So one of them was, despite its faults, that we know that the Child Canada tax benefit has had a measurable impact on child poverty, and certainly when we looked at the measurement and the impact here in PEI, across the kind of we're at about 20% in terms of 18 to 20% in terms of working poor in PEI, and that impact is noticeable for what you would call your reference family. My concern is a couple of pieces around there, particularly with childcare costs, is that we've only recently had a change here under our social assistance that child care support is not considered income when it comes to social assistance rates, for example, because it was acting as a disincentive for people to be able to enter the workforce. You know, if they see a small change in their income that put them out of the bracket where they're eligible, then they were no longer there. So they were having to make choices about not working to remain eligible for childcare. So I am a bit concerned about that. I get the the reflection, but childcare costs are not an option. And I would not consider them income in the same, or childcare support as an option either for, in terms of what families do with it. For most families, that money is not going on discretionary expenses, like it's going towards that expense. The other aspect of that, and I think these things connect together regarding the reference family, is we've done some work looking at one of the angles around refundable and non-refundable tax credits. And in that modeling, there was a recommendation was that the reference on that would be a middle-aged single adult, because it removed some of those other more variable factors, and because those are the ones that basically had the biggest gap to make up. The numbers that we're seeing here in PEI is that, a reference family of the 2 adults, 2 children is at currently, with all of the pieces of various income spaces, is at about 80% to 85% of the MBM poverty level, whereas a single person is at 60%. So there's a bigger gap to make up for those single individuals in terms of impact. They also make up our largest percentage of those who are the lowest income earners from a social assistance piece. So I know that's a lot of context, but I guess the short question from all of that is, when we do modeling on this, is it likely that we could end up with a couple of different recommendations based on those the big differences that we see in those 2 different references between single middle-aged adult and a reference family which incorporates childcare?
Yes, so these are some of the conversations we're having about whether we need to be thinking about perhaps doing a weighted average, so figuring out what a living wage rate might be for a single adult earner, doing the full costing calculations, and then comparing it to various other families, as you're talking about. That is one of the questions on the table. I would, we've decided that we aren't going to calculate and show what, for example, a single earner might need a living wage versus the 2-family, 2-child in the way that you're saying. But what we have done is use the reference family and tested it to make sure that it does cover those individuals. If you do it the other way around, chances are, even if you take out the childcare and you take out the Canada Child Benefit, you still are going to have a living wage that is below what that reference family will need. So, in other words, what's the highest level of income level that will ensure that nobody is worse off, right? And in terms of your question around childcare, if I'm understanding you correctly, the childcare expense is included in the budget, and we do all the calculations that consider, how you can use the tax system in terms of childcare costs and deductions. We do not, however, include in our calculations the childcare subsidy programs, because those are not universal, and depending on what community you are in, you may not even be able to get access to childcare. So we don't consider that something that we can count on for the family. It's something that is not a sure thing. Those subsidy programs have not been considered in as we've done them. So Nova Scotia does have an income support program for childcare. It turns out that for this family's income level, the support would be very, very low. And we know that many families can't even access the childcare, even if they had the subsidy. So we don't actually include the subsidy. We do include the Canada Child Benefit. And in fact, we've been doing the calculations pre and post. And what happened when we did the calculations after the full year of the Canada Child Benefit, what it did was actually it it covered the inflationary costs going forward for our reference family. So the wage in some communities was went down because the Canada Child Benefit was generous enough for families that the wage went down slightly. In our communities, the wage stayed the same despite the fact that there were inflationary increases. And so that is causing us to have a look at whether we need to do a weighted hourly wage. I hope that's answered your question.
Hannibal?
Thank you. Yes, it was a complex scenario, and that really helps. I guess my follow up to that just is absolutely. I'm really reassured to hear the approach regarding the subsidy, because the two things you mentioned are exactly the challenge. Is that is a program which has had obviously a huge value, but it is very limited in its scope, because you talked about the cutoff points, and that program is related to the very lowest of income, versus, even though it's not directly connected to social assistance, the cutoff points are low, and in addition, when there are barriers to accessing the service itself, it's irrelevant whether there's a program there. So making that a condition of or a fixed point in the calculation would not be accurate to reflect our space. I guess, my takeaway from that, though, is that because it sounds like, it would always be a work in progress, is that part of our recommendation should be that this is not a fixed point in time, but it is a continually reevaluated benchmark based on so many moving pieces. It would need to be redone on a regular basis to reflect what changes may happen in the environment.
Yes.
Gord?
Thanks for your presentation. It was fantastic. Just trying to see if you can help give us some guidance about our modeling. We're heading into a period where we've had a lot of great presenters, and is there anything that you would like to kind of tell this committee to look at when we head into our modeling, that you can think of off the top of your head, just to give us some parameters, potentially? I know it's a tough question.
It is a tough question. I'd have to think a little bit about that. You could have a look at, and I'm trying to think of what it's called. David McDonald, who's our senior economist in Ottawa, did do a report on kind of modeling around basic income, which had some conclusions that might be helpful. I assume you're using the SPSDM, whatever that program is called, that allows you to do some of the modeling. He is our expert at CCPA on the moving variables in terms of that. What I'd say is, one of the things about a pilot is taking into consideration the context of what's happening. So, I'm talking about, we just talked about the childcare program, but within a community, how do you consider what's available in terms of public health care, or what impact tuition might be, or what have you? I think in many ways, we have lots of evidence that tells us what happens when we give people more income. Obviously, some of the things that you're thinking through would be these eligibility lines, right? So if you do get access to social housing, if you do get access to whatever a program might be, you need to make sure that people are not having that clawed back. So especially when you're thinking about things that are geared to income, I'm thinking in particular of social housing, where it's geared to a certain percentage of income. You want to make sure that people are not worse off. The seniors part of this, I don't know what your numbers are, what percentage in terms of seniors living in poverty, but I see some concerning numbers about seniors poverty increasing. I haven't looked at yours, just happened to be digging into the numbers the other day in various provinces, in Newfoundland in particular. But I think the seniors poverty is a really good example of what we did right? The OAS, the GIS, but that all fit within a society where we were looking to support seniors, whether that's a Shoppers Drug Mart, sorry, not to mention a corporation, but, a discount that supports our seniors to get the essentials that I talked about, or other ways, public transit subsidies, those kinds of things, which together make it possible for us to support seniors. Obviously, depending on the poverty line, some of that won't be captured. But it seems to me that, we're at a particular place where if your modeling isn't capturing the outside of the income, that's kind of a concern, because whether it be replicable, Friday afternoon, whether, you can replicate that again, and whether it's capturing really what's happening is quite difficult. You can't really model that, but that is, I think, part of that qualitative data that you need to be getting at while you're doing the quantitative. But I do think, to end where I started, David McDonald's modeling out of our Ottawa office could be helpful for what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. Any further questions from the committee? I have just one more quick question. So you mentioned the value of certification programs that exist in other jurisdictions where, an employer can be certified as a living wage employer. They're not mandated in any location in Canada to pay a living wage, but these programs would allow recognition of employers who are paying a living wage. Are any of those processes, those are all, okay, let's start that again. The certification programs that exist are not through government, correct? Or no? Yeah. Okay. Would that be how you would suggest we approach it here as well, or through an NGO or some other non-governmental organization?
It is how it has been done, partially because government is an employer. So unless you are going to come forward and become a living wage employer, you might want a nonprofit organization that is at arm's length to be the certification body. And while we might all just say, well, don't we already pay a living wage, where the rubber hits the road in terms of public sector employers are the cleaners in your buildings, the contracting out of services, et cetera, et cetera. So part of why it's been arm's length is because government is also an employer.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I just wonder, you might not know the answer to this, but do you know if government funding has been provided to support these programs?
I don't know if any government funding has been provided directly. I know, and maybe you were involved in the SHIRK project, which of course is government funded, but through competitive research. I think most of the work that I can think of has been funded by foundations, and like our first partnership was with the United Way or the labor movement.
Further questions for Dr. Saulnier? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. That was incredibly helpful. We really appreciate you taking the time on a Friday afternoon and your patience with our technical difficulties. All right. So we will take a quick break, and then we'll just complete the remaining part of our agenda.
Thank you.
All right, so moving on to new business. Does anybody have any new business they would like to bring forward at this time? So just to remind the committee, we do have a meeting scheduled for next week on the 18th, and that is an in-camera meeting to discuss our report and to start moving forward on recommendations based on the presentations we have heard. We have, and also the material that we have received from different organizations to review. Our clerk, Emily, has sent out a document that summarizes all of the presentations, so I strongly encourage everybody to take a look at that. There's a lot there, but it is very helpful in terms of understanding the scope and themes that we've heard so far, and I think will really be helpful in moving us forward. All right, so with that, I will ask for a motion to adjourn. Sunny. All right, thanks everyone.